Eva. Thank you, Eva. And now we're ready for the discussion. And I think you did an, an excellent job in a way to stage the discussion by your attention to reminding us all about the importance of Husserl.
Mm.
And so there is a question that appeared in the chat room, and then Mark follow up on it. So Mark, can I give you the honors of facilitating the the discussion now, perhaps?
Yes, well, I mean,
Yeah.
it's yeah, I'll do my best. Uh, well, Jerome's question is, did I find it hard to understand? I think going to Husserl's original writings is there's a lot of it, and of course there are lots of periods in his thinking, so it's very hard to sort of find your way through this. I have Loet to thank for my appreciation of Husserl's contribution, and that really came through not Husserl directly, but through Alfred Schutz. And particularly, there was one conversation that we had, which in the end led to a paper, which is Schutz's paper about music, which is a beautiful thing. It's called Making Music Together, if anybody knows it. But it's really an elaboration and a deepening of Husserl's theory of intersubjectivity, directed at answering the question, how does music communicate? And this made me realize the importance of Husserl, both historically and in terms of, you know, the contribution, the ideas that then feed into Parsons, and of course that Parsons Schutz correspondence is incredibly, that's such a key moment in sociology. So I didn't find going to Husserl straight away easy. Husserl was my introduction, as Schutz was my introduction.
All right, perhaps Jerome, since you raised the question, do you would like to tell us something about Husserl and how you think he relates to Loet's work? Or is anyone else interested in joining in?
Jerome, we cannot hear you. Seems that you are muted or...
Can you hear me now? Hello,
Yes.
hello. And now as well, yes?
Yeah.
It's getting
Okay.
better. It's better now.
I had to switch the microphone. Yeah, I was saying I'm probably not the best person, as I last read Husserl when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Alabama more than 10 years ago, studying basically religious studies. Well, basically studying courses that I found interesting, but I just wound up doing a lot of religious studies. And one of my professors, Timothy Murphy, who is unfortunately no longer with us, was big on semiotics, and among others, Roland Barthes and this whole tradition. And it was via him that actually I was exposed to this, I guess somewhat you might consider it part of the post-structuralist or post-modernist tradition, even Nietzsche, and in particular Husserl. I found very, very refreshing this notion of the phenomenology dealing with sensory, basically perception, things that we perceive, as opposed to looking as much of traditional philosophy does with ideal concepts. If you look at Aquinas and sort of this tradition, there is more of this notion of finding a separation. And I think Loet deals with some of this between mind and matter, between thought and concepts and reflection, and actually just maybe even getting beyond these sort of dichotomies. I guess, Mark, this was your discussion between the dualism and monadism as well. And basically, yes, moving towards, again, communication, understanding. So that's how I grasped Husserl. Again, it's been many years, so I have to refresh my memory.
Anyone ready, or anyone would like to chime in?
Can I just say, one of the things that really, I mean, this is sort of coming out of both Andrea and Ava's talk, is this book is bringing this stuff to life. I mean, on the one hand, we've got the historical context, which is still very much with us. And, you know, you've only got to look at some of the stuff that's going on in Eastern Europe at the moment, and then the philosophical context. These are things which are incredibly relevant and important to us when our world is in a very perilous position, it seems to me.
Perhaps I would like to pose on the following question. Does Eva talking about Husserl, the way, Mark said, Husserl to me didn't make sense until one day someone said, well, he's about making distinctions. He's the one who introduced the idea to think of the human mind as making distinctions. And this, the thing that we do or that we need to do before we actually can say something regarding logic. And that brings me down to, I think, page 13 of chapter 1, where Loet is commenting on George Spencer Brown, who kind of really perfected what does it mean to make a distinction. And so I'm giving that as a question to everyone. One could say that there are different versions of George Spencer Brown now, the ones who really literally take him on, and also the ones who say, yeah, he is interesting, he gave us a model of a distinction, but there's actually something missing in it. And so my understanding is that Loet is pointing out that making a distinction is different from making an observation. And I'm just curious how all of you think about that, whether you think it's really important to realize that making a distinction is an action, but there are all sorts of other things that need to happen before we actually can do something productive. Jerry Chandler?
Thank you, Jamie. And first, to Loet very directly, very happy to see your book and see the your efforts to clarify your various works. As you know, we've been friends for many, many years and have heard each other's viewpoints for these years and had very profitable discussions. Nevertheless, I really would like to raise out a point here, which I think I see as a sort of a grounding distinction between particularly the work of Husserl and that of anticipatory systems and Robert Rosen's writings. As you're well aware, Husserl's contributions are in the general area of mathematical set theory and its associated philosophical, if you would, denotations of the meaning of anything. It is, set theory is not a complete absolute philosophical void. It just often appears to be. Now, the point of anticipatory systems in the sense of Robert Rosen and his use of not of set theory, but rather of category theory, is to attain the notion of identity, identity within some context. And this he addresses in terms of his relationships between causality and inferences, and his demand for a dictionary that relate causality to inferences. This sort of philosophical perspective of causality is very, very remote from the notions of Husserl and set theory. So I do see, and what this then comes to in the pragmatic setting of Charles Saunders Peirce or others is the necessity for the notion of identity and the role of identity in communication. And this role of identity in communication between the sender and receiver is, if you would, simply erased in the context of Shannon information. So it's part of this then is that I see this necessity to develop some sort of notion of communication that embodies how you make the distinction here. And this sense of identity is obviously very crucial to social systems and is part of the grounding set of notions of a democracy and the rights of the individual as an individual, as someone with concrete rights. Again, in Husserl, this sort of view is simply erased, I guess would be the way I would look at it. So I'll stop there and invite comments and counterpositions and whatnot. I would also add that I did enjoy Mark Johnson's presentation, although I missed the first part of it. And I look forward to seeing his slides and having a chance to study them. Thank you.
Jerry, can you say something about Rosen's insistence on a dictionary? I don't know Rosen's work in that level of detail, but I would agree with you if that's where his thinking. Well, there are two things. If that's where his thinking was, yes, that would be a problem. I also think, however, that Daniel Dubois' development of Rosen in terms of a sort of computational anticipatory system would get around that problem. But if you can say something a little bit more about Rosen's ideas about a dictionary of causality.
Well, yes, actually, I've addressed it on two separate occasions on the Club of Remy YouTube videos. And so you can find
okay, all right, well, I can look at
60
that.
or 70 minutes worth of,
right.
of my views there, which is probably more than you want.
Probably, yes. But
but anyway, so for this immediate purpose, Rosen's view, starting from the highly abstract conceptualization of relation or illation in terms of language, uses category theory and his personal perspectives of category theory, which is somewhat different than the standard mathematical form. He has, in fact, a box on the left, which he labels as causality, and sees some flow through that box. And on the right, he has what he called another box, which he calls inference. And in that inference box, he puts mathematics and whatever else you want. And he links these two boxes, one to the other, by a dictionary. And it is the nature of this dictionary, which he then should have, in my opinion, should have developed, but he doesn't. He just leaves it open in terms of the reader can put into the dictionary what the reader so chooses. And of course, if you're a philosopher, you will put in philosophical terminology in the dictionary. If you are a physician, you'll put in signs and symptoms in the dictionary of the patient. If you are a mathematician, you'll put in mathematical terminologies regarding the structures of mathematics. And so what Husserl puts in that dictionary is his notions of set theory as derived from Frege and Cantor and others.
Yeah. All right, I'll have to think about that. I mean, to be honest, I'm not. No, it's a question for Loet really, but perhaps we can explore that in the group chat afterwards. But it seems to me that Daniel Dubois, his contribution to this has been really critical, and Dubois' concept of an anticipatory system is much more consistent with people like George Kelly, who talk about the nature of a construct being an anticipation. And it's a pattern. Something happens in the past to which a pattern is constructed, which can help you steer your actions in the future. Now, that you can call that a systems model of itself, but that's certainly what I've gained from Loet's work in terms of situating this sort of model of the system itself in the communication dynamics.
Yeah, Mark, I would just add to this, yes, I agree very much. Daniel Dubois, who's a personal friend of mine, a colleague, and I've attended many of his meetings in Liège. He has extended Rosen's work in new directions, as others have as well. And so it's one has to be very cautious on when you use the word anticipatory system, whose anticipatory system views are you addressing? And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, completely agree.
And my view of anticipatory systems originally originated in the notion of how could a mutation in a single DNA base result in the change of an entire organism. And in this case, the standard model, this is well known across the field of genetics, from bacteria to human beings. A single DNA base anticipates an entirely different new organism. Or well, at least a dynamically different organism. It's not entirely new, but a dynamically different. So there's this gap in language between a simple chemical change and a major biological shift. That's
thank you.
That's anticipation that in my view of it.
Let's explore this in the chat. I think it's really fascinating. Jerome has got a question. Oh, and Andrea. So Jerome and then Andrea.
Well, question, comment, reaction. I don't know what will come out, but regarding what Jerry Chandler just said, I thought of a passage in the book. If you don't mind, I will just read it. It's very short, just a paragraph from Loet. And it's on page 21. And then it says, when Latour, for example, quoted Pasteur, Louis Pasteur, saying, "Give me a laboratory and I will raise the world." The resulting world was a new option attributed by Latour to Pasteur's imagination of a vaccine. Historically, Pasteur demonstrated his capacity to vaccinate cows against cowpox to journalists. The journalists had to formulate intra-reflexively the translation of scientific news to newspaper items. Their work is both reflection and action. The relations between scientific and journalistic coding are made specific in instances. To me, this seems to be how Loet would respond, Jerry, to your idea or your reservation about the dictionary. And in fact, I thought when reading this, and I wrote in the margins here, Ludwig Fleck, who talks about the social nature of science and the idea of thought collectives, and even refers to exoteric versus esoteric thought collectives. You have, for instance, in medicine, there are specialists, and then there are just your general practitioners who have varying degrees of, I guess, specificity of knowledge. And so that's the comment. And then I guess my question part also relates to what Jerry Chandler said in relation to this whole notion of communication and the relation between even the notion of Wertfreiheit that Loet advances and the notion of pragmatism, again, that Jerry Chandler just mentioned. I think it's a very interesting question, again, to what use some of these concepts are put, and to what extent one must, I guess, escape from even a communicative framework in order to, I don't know, discuss topics like ethics and power relations and so on. Again, these are just very broad questions. I'm not sure how and who would respond in what way.
Does anybody want to respond? Okay, so again, if people have any thoughts, there is an online chat. Andrea, you had your hand up briefly?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to share another kind of observation which puzzled me when I reread the chapter in the preparation of today, and I was wondering if the rest of the audience kind of is similar, disrupted by it or inspired by it. And I'm referring to as you heard already me talking, so I'm kind of so I'm also thinking a lot about history. We probably all do. On page 8, at the beginning of page 8, Loet writes about Max Weber's work, and he cites Weber, and he says, according to Weber, values are ideal typical constructs. They operate in history as coordination mechanisms. And in the Sinn der Wertfreiheit in the social sciences serves our ability to study these values without an a priori commitment to them. So I understand that. Later on that page, Loet comes back to the role of history, and in the last paragraph writes, the historical events provide variation, but the system dynamics are structural. They operate in terms of selection mechanism. And while Loet is not really talking about that, but I was wondering, I sometimes wonder if there is something in this methodological kind of tradition to think that the number of problems we are confronted with is actually not infinite, but finite, but that they take another shape whenever they kind of, whenever our reality changes. And I'm bringing this to this table because in my own personal quests of trying to orient in the different discourses in different fields, I more and more felt the need to get kind of very simple, almost like school-like first grade student-like reference systems. And then I discovered that actually the bibliographical domain, so the idea to evolve large classification systems applied to library, as Dewey did or Paul Otlet did in Belgium, that they actually were kind of, they had the same kind of struggle, and they tried to find solutions. So if you today look into those systems, you see concepts as expressed in terms, and you see flavored them, and you see them at different places. But I'm still wondering if this is an illusion, or maybe a desperate kind of hope that there is a kind of a limited set of generic problems. And the hope, or the hope in that is that we are able to find examples to which we can map the current problems we are dealing with. So can we find translations of current problems into other problems, in a deeper way than just finding examples which look the same at the surface? And I'm just curious what this audience think about. Maybe you think about it's all a very unstructured thinking of mine, which most likely it is.
So anybody got a response to that? I know Caroline's got her hand up for another question, but Richard.
I mean, we can start with Caroline and come back to it. It doesn't really matter which way you want to go.
Well, I think Caroline's got a different question, but I'm just wondering if anyone wants to respond to Andrea's question about problems.
Okay. Well, probably the most influential person in my understanding is Kuhn. And what I always liked about Kuhn is he defined research in terms of this as a series of problems that people have socially constructed. And these are wicked problems, which means they never get solved. So communities never die, and they evolve. And in the later part of his career, he actually characterized research more in an evolutionary process where you take a problem and you break it up into little teeny pieces with little experiments, of which most of them fail. And a few of them work really well. And we communicate in the literature. We never communicate in the literature much of what fails. When we have a really great success, we usually hold it back for a year or two so we can monetize it in some way either. And so there's this whole tradition, and it's also, there are a couple of people that are at MIT and looking at research and innovation. They look at it in terms of a series of problems and how problems evolve. So you're not alone in that. It's actually the way I tend to model research. And it's very much informed my entire history of what I've been doing. I view them as a series of ill-defined problems. The problem that I tend to work on is how do we characterize the structure of research using the open literature? That's a problem that can't be solved. And from working on it for 40 years, and I guarantee you, no matter what we do, it will not be solved. But it's a worthwhile problem. You get joy in cracking parts of it. So I do see that as one way of looking at this phenomenon. And I'm trying now from here to learn, because that's not the way that this group looks at it. They look at it more in terms of communication. But I do resonate with what you brought up, because I very much look at this as a shared set of set problems. If there's 100 people working on a problem in a community, and there's over 1 million people, 10 million people, that means there's 100,000 problems. But do the math. And can we actually identify them and show their evolution? So there are people that follow that, and that's one of them that I care about.
Okay, thank you. Stasa?
Okay, so yeah, this is a fascinating discussion, and while I agree, like I'm inspired also on the idea of working on problems, but as Andrea was saying, are the problems the same? It's really, or like, can we translate, or can we translate the problems or move the problems? It occurred to me that actually, while we see that the problems are the same, the way we see them is in a way reflected in this book. And they're the same because we have the same worldviews, right? If we view the world as a system, then we can start seeing each of these separate problems as a system type problem. And we can see the solutions being similar in a way. So my, like the flip of that is, are the problems themselves similar, so we can learn something from them, or can we go deeper in finding solutions that can be translated, or is it our views? And in this instance, it's the view, which is the systems driven view, making us do that. Yeah, so I don't know.
Okay. I've got a question, I suppose, Andrea, which is, what do you mean by a problem?
That's a good one.
I'm just thinking.
I wouldn't be able to give a no. You caught me. I'm not able to give an explanation. What do I mean by a problem?
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples if that would help. Right now, we're sitting here with a problem trying to understand Loet's book, and we all have different perspectives. And that's the interesting thing. We come together, and it's kind of a social group. There's not 100 people here, but 20, 25. That's within the range of a group. Trying to understand this, and we all present different parts of it, but we're engaged because of a shared interest in trying to understand that and learn. Physicists, they're searching for new, pieces of matter. I mean, there's a whole series of looking at that. All the bibliometricians, I mean, if you started going back to ISI, it's how do we commercialize the ISI database? I hate to say it, but a lot of that research is all how to commercialize a database driven by profit. That'd be an interesting way to think about the history of bibliometrics and scientometrics. Is Garfield's attempt to try and commercialize the ISI databases. How well would that explain to you all of the actions and debates that have gone on in the field for 30 years? So it's that reflection of what the problem might be, and the fact that any one problem, the members of that community will have slightly different definitions. It's like, look, you go to a church or a synagogue, they go there for some common process, but I guarantee you everybody thinks differently. Yeah, go there slightly differently there, but they're under the same roof. So it's a very, studying the evolution of problems is a fun thing to do, because you actually see how, you say, gee, I can't solve that problem, but somebody over there has a solution that might help my problem. So I will build upon them. We're not building on the shoulders of giants. We're building on people that have made some abilities to solve some problems in some incomplete way, and we think that might help us.
Okay. I'm going to move the topic because Caroline's been waiting for ages to ask a question, and it preceded this discussion. So Caroline, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks. It's great to be here. I'm sorry I had to come in a little bit late. And I think Andrea would agree with me that most problems that we deal with day to day are presented to us by our children. So yeah, aside from that, that's not very philosophical. I'm sorry, but
being older, Carolyn, is the grandchild that's literally crying in the next room. So I get what you're saying.
Right, exactly. Okay, so let me. I want to ask a question, and you know, I would like to know what people think about this. So it seems to me in reading this chapter, and I need to study it more, but that you know, really what my sense of Luke's perspective is that at some point we have an emergent order that is you know, to a great extent precedes us, right? That we really have no control over, and that at some points the emergent structures meet a kind of social system, and that the social system then feeds back on the emergent structure, and that somewhere in there, there's kind of liminal space where some freedom is offered, but the freedom and uncertainty are combined, and so at least that's how I read it, and that at the moments of freedom and uncertainty, we also see a great deal of cultural influence there in terms of norms of behavior. And so it seems to me that one of the challenges of the book, and that, you know, particularly I think in relation, my own interest is in innovation, particularly innovation in, you know, new ideas and new technologies. You know, if we wanted to encourage that liminal space between freedom and uncertainty, what are the features of our meeting between determined and social structures that would increase that, right? And Loet talks about the fact that we want to reduce uncertainty, and a lot of times it's because uncertainty makes us uncomfortable. But do we want an innovation system to actually increase that? And how would we do that, or how would we begin to even think about measuring that space? So that's my question.
I have to say I'm a big fan of increasing uncertainty because I think it stimulates dialogue. But has anybody else got any thoughts on this?
I would just throw in a little bit of a facetious remark, in the sense that the gap between uncertainty and freedom is the opportunity for creativity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how would you measure that? How would you measure that?
Depends on what domain or discipline you're in. Creativity is sort of part of human intelligence, or part of, if you wanted some sort of notion of understanding of utility, or any number of possible measurements, but it's very much dependent on which discipline you're in. Obviously, the choreographer's notion of creativity is very different from that of a poet, which is in turn very different from that of a mathematician. These are different facets of human intelligence. That's how I'm using the language, at least.
I mean,
yeah, I would like to add perhaps that what do we mean by uncertainty? Because if we go in the literature, and I'm thinking of Gigerenzer and Lorraine Daston, who looked at the history of what have people meant by uncertainty over the last 1,000 years or something. So I'm raising them more as a question to your question. So what do we mean by uncertainty, and also what metaphors are we using? And maybe metaphors might be helpful to get a better understanding of of what we mean. So that's my comment.
Any thoughts on that?
So I think that I like the idea of how you call that liminal space of this kind of this space.
Liminal, 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 liminal.
Liminal space. I like this, yeah, and I was typing it. I started typing into the chat. I think to a certain extent, the freedom, which is also needed, yeah, is also illusionary, because if we really commit ourselves to system dynamics view, thanks Stasia for the reminding us for the shared perspective, then you never operate outside of a boundary. You always have boundary conditions given by being part of something. So mathematically, you would model that by adding noise, yeah. So, and that noise mathematically is an expression of uncertainty, but uncertainty can have different flavors. So we know from evolutionary theory, so mutation can be as disruptive as it can be constructive. So you create a lot of mutations, and you cannot have anything new without mutations created. Yeah, that's not possible. But that doesn't mean that any mutation created is leading to something brilliant in terms of selection. I think this is also what we can learn from the book, which is exemplified over and over again. So then the question is, from a systemic point of view, how much of that space the system is willing to provide, in which kind of form, without without running the risk of becoming unfunctional. So when I studied statistical physics in the 80s, yeah, and then there was very popular, I think it was Manfred Eigen who wrote about a mutation kind of window. But I also remember there was also an engineer and German engineer, Ingo Rechenberg. That's all the context of evolutionary algorithms. So that's very early kind of playing with trying to find optimal solutions for very hands-on problems. So Rechenberg tried to develop a pipe in which the turbulence was almost turbulence free, so that the stream of water could be better. Yeah, and then they played around with cards, and then in the cards they changed the parameters, and then they built the model. Yeah, and then they would build it again and measure the turbulence or the kind of the flux through. So and then I think it was Rechenberg or maybe Eigen, but they then argued if you have too much mutation, and I think Loet also wrote often about it, if you have too much mutation, your selection mechanism breaks down.
Yes,
because you cannot test all of them. Yeah, so there is no building up. It all exists next to each other. If you have too much selection, yeah, then whenever something changes, you have not enough of the crazy kind of mutation stuff to start anew. Then you also die. And in between those two kind of charybdis, yeah, and Scylla and charybdis, you need to find an optimum. And where the optimum is, I think is different for each of the systems we are in. Yeah, and how you then translate that. I know that from the US, but maybe Rick knows that better. They used to have these NSF used to have these kind of crazy programs. My husband, who is a theoretical physicist, a high energy physicist, sometimes told me stories about it. So they had these programs, you had to submit an absolutely idiotic, not reliable kind of project. So they try to instrumentalize this kind of free floating way, yeah, and I think to bring back to our perception that we need to have this free floating, even if we kind of not producing anything beautiful at the first glance, on the first attempt, that's also needed. Sometimes I think we over optimize ourselves, but so this is how I would relate in my own kind of language to what you describe. But how to measure that would be interesting.
Andrea, I think you started the your discussion with the notion of your background in theoretical physics or physical language and physical mathematics. I would argue that Loet's viewpoint is that if you, well, I shouldn't put this, I'll say, this is how I interpret Loet, but it's also basically my own opinion as well, that if you start with the mathematics of theoretical physics, you're imprisoned in a prison which will never release you to create the freedom of being open and compassionate and otherwise a normal human being. This language is a straitjacket, a linguistic straitjacket that paints mathematics as something firm and established and full of boundaries of this and that, and yum. It's a nonsense language if you try and translate it into normal human communication. And the point is that mathematics is much richer than that, vastly richer than that. And you just have to find the gaps which you seek, and then find the mathematical languages in which to express them.
Yeah, I mean, this is also an interesting reflection on the history of the epistemological kind of flavors of different disciplines. So
yes.
I moved from statistical physics to philosophy of science. And so, but what I still treasure from my statistical physics first kind of impregnation or first kind of teaching, yeah, is Boltzmann. So it's the understanding that how you do, which is actually then at the root of complexity theory. So how you handle large scale kind of ensembles of relatively homogeneous kind of units, and how you can derive phenomenological, that's the physics kind of contribution he did, how you can derive phenomenological explanations on the level of a system. Yeah. So
well,
I think mathematics, I'm also not, I also not think that one can, that the kind of mathematics finally determines. I think it's agnostic. I think there is an agnosticity, at least in the methods you use and the way you think. Yeah, isn't it?
Well, I would not agree with that. I really wouldn't. The notion of how you approach systems theory depends on which language you wish to express it in. And this then depends on the ontology of information. And the ontology of information as part of communication is one of Loet's major points. And this is certainly not constrained in at least as I read Loet's, to a particular scientific domain such as physics.
I'm conscious Jerome has had his hand up for ages and he's got 2 points.
Yes, one to the discussion that's ongoing right now and one to the prior one. So I'll start with the current discussion to not confuse people. So to the question that Margareta asked or that Jamie asked, and also to what Andrea was just saying, I think that maybe in agreement also with what Jerry Chandler was saying, that maybe this perspective on noise in terms of uncertainty is not always very informative when we're discussing uncertainty in social situations. Usually, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, we're usually talking about choice. So we're presented with, a selection of choices, a menu of choices, however you want to say. And I think uncertainty, to me, is what arises or what exists as the perceived probability of the events that we associate with those choices tends towards 50%. So I'm not sure, it's a flip of a coin. And as we have more information or knowledge about the individual choices, we can restrict the choice set down to, more reasonable subdomains and say, well, the rest we can ignore. Of course, then that raises the question of, on the basis of what are we ignoring those choices? That's my view on that issue. Others may have different view. I would welcome their contribution. On the earlier discussion, I think this is really interesting. This dichotomy that Loet raises in the book between historical events and these evolutionary dynamics, which have or comprise logics, which there can be various ones of. And so, in terms of the question that Andrea asked, how can we determine whether there are choices that are similar or whether these are just at a superficial level comparable problems? I think that Loet, and again, Loet may think differently, would suggest that it is in the interaction of these different logics that the observation of similarities would arise in a sort of, this is a triple helix as I understand it, and that again interacts again upon the historical events themselves and in a sort of a second order cybernetic event. And I like the reference, and I appreciate the reference by Loet to the writing of David Noble, who wrote, An America by Design, also Forces of Production, and a number of his other books on the interaction between, for instance, the machine goods industry in the United States during and after the Second World War, and the influence on that of the military spending. Say the logic of machine goods was, in some sense, a dependent factor variable of the funding coming from military sources. And that influenced, again, how investment was going on, how innovation was going on in that industry. So, okay, I've talked enough.
Okay. I suppose one of the things that is still sort of lurking, so one of the key ideas here is that there is a mechanism for the construction of the selection mechanism for communication. And so it's not so much about, we say, oh, well, they must be selected, the communications must be selected, but how is that selection mechanism constructed? That seems to be the really key operational question here. I mean, there is a proposal in the book as to how that's done, and personally, I find it very satisfying. But I'm just wondering if there are any thoughts about that, because it sort of ties into what you were saying, Andrea, really.
I perhaps have a general comment vis-a-vis what Jerry was saying and relating to Andrea. Dus when we talk about mathematical systems, we're actually dealing with two very different mathematical philosophies, and I think it's impossible to avoid discussing it. And one is just the mathematical Platonism in its many varieties, and now we have the intuitionism that I understand to be a form of psychologism of Brouwers, that's from the Netherlands. But then we have also the pure constructivism. And so I see three very, very different engagements with mathematics. And I think that this maybe what was below what Jerry was saying, but also how we move forward developing models, that we need to check in with our interlocutors, how they think about mathematics before we actually can really make a productive engagement with them. This is an open question that I'm raising. And so as a footnote, this my background is not in cybernetics or in scientometrics or in system science. I'm coming from strategic management, but I'm really here because I think we need some sort of cybernetic or a way of thinking where we really look at the feedback loops and how everything is in some sort of bundle of feedback loops, and how we think about that and how we communicate about that. So that's why I helped organize this book reading, and I look forward to your feedback to this question that I raised.
Well, I would just say at this point that Loet discusses selection in this sense as being different from natural selection, in that I find this discussion very interesting, this distinction between the genotypical and the phenotypical within this social realm of selection versus the natural, and that they are not given. So I think a lot of this has to just occur on the plane, this is my view, my reading, on the historical plane. You know, we have things like social movements, again, bread riots, you know, if things are not working correctly in our social systems, you know, people go into the streets. So.
Gerard.
Many questions have been raised, and we still have many months to answer them. So I have resisted trying to answer the questions because I'm sure we will be dealing with them in the future. Mm-hmm. So I would like to introduce another question myself. Mark, at some point, was talking about anticipatory systems. And he seemed to be saying, I have written it down, but maybe I didn't understand it correctly. He seemed to be saying that anticipatory systems use a model of the past in order to predict the future. Now, that, to my mind, is not an anticipatory system, but it's a prediction system, just like science actually is, because that's the reason we build models. So for me, it is a quite interesting question. What is the difference between prediction and anticipation? I just checked in on page 1 of chapter 1, because it says here, anticipation as a selection mechanism in cultural evolutions. So there is a type of definition of participation, but it focuses on selection. So that raises for me the question, what is it that we select? So if we talk, that's my question, and I'm not expecting that you immediately answer that, but I would raise the question, where do anticipations come from?
Yeah.
We can say that predictions come from the past, but where do anticipations come from? So
I have to apologize for my slightly careless use of language in my presentation then, because I completely agree with you. And it is in Loet's work, it is in the distinction between incursion and hyperincursion. And the anticipatory system is in that interference between, Dubois' 3 dimensions there, which are recursion, incursion, and hyperincursion. But it's not in chapter 1. You've got to get to chapter 4 to get that. But I think that's a much I think that would cover your concern there. So I was careless.
No, I'm not criticizing in any sense, but I still raise the question: where does it come from? Because in the definition that you just mentioned, there is no source of the anticipation. We can only say if there are certain movements, then maybe they're interacting with each other, and somehow something emerges that is an anticipation.
Well, I think that's it, isn't it?
That is not anticipation.
Well, okay, so I think in the interaction between those 3 dynamics, you see, this is such an important, this really gets to the heart of the argument, I feel.
I think too, yeah.
Because it's an ontology. of it. It's an ontology of stratified relations in social systems between metasystem and system, which does not presuppose an ontological distinction between those systems. That's why I mentioned the critical realism, because the critical realism makes an ontological claim, which I don't think is defensible. Whereas Loet is doing something much more sophisticated, because he's not presupposing a mind-independent reality, but he is saying that there are strata in society. There's a dualist dynamic, which is the result of a self-organizing process in communications.
I still have the feeling that there is something more to this issue. For example, if I understood you correctly, but it doesn't matter whether I did, there is a general tendency to consider prediction as one of the aims of science. But very often people realize that there is a different process which is called anticipation. Now, prediction always uses the past. Otherwise, it wouldn't be prediction. So anticipation uses something else. Now we can give mathematical terms to it, or we can give dynamic terms to it, but it still doesn't explain where anticipation comes from. Just to give an example, we are here, there are now 24 people here. None of us, well, every one of us has a history, but the fact that we are together is independent of that history. So the fact that we are independent of that history, talking to each other, actually helps us, each of us, to anticipate certain events that we can use maybe in some future time. So the questions that arise here and the answers given actually help us to anticipate our personal future. But it's not dependent on our past, but it's dependent on the present in which we actually talk to that. So I just try to get a little bit more of the width of this notion of anticipation.
Yeah, but I think this is incredibly important. This is why I feel this book is extremely important. It's a very important contribution because it is presenting an answer to this question. You might disagree with it, and there are plenty of people in the social sciences who've got different views on this, but I think it's a very, very important and original argument for how anticipation works. My own feeling is, ultimately we're dealing with some kind of interference between diachronic processes and synchronic processes. It may be that those processes, it may be there's something in the biology that we still need to look at. So, I mean, we've got autopoiesis, but we know that, biological systems are not, there's more to it than that.
Well, I would like to explore that. As you have seen in the program, I will talk as well on Loet's book. We know each other already also more than 30 years, so there are connections.
Yeah, this is wonderful, and yeah. So the group is there, and obviously I think your reflections on this later in the series are going to be also very, very important. So, well, thank you. Has anybody else got any thoughts on what Joe just said?
If I may, since the opportunity was presented, I'm wonder the relation between anticipation and imagination. And in the past, Loet and I have talked about Freud and whether Sigmund Freud could have become a sociologist or not. And what that really is about is dus the fantasy life of the individual mind. And so that's what I'm kind of interested in, is finding a connection between the fantasy life or imagination and how that translates into this a productive research construct that can be used to actually solve problems, so to say. So that was my first thought when I heard you asking your questions, Gerard. Yeah.
Yes. No, I think you are very close to what I would think that the source of anticipation is. It's still humans, and we are able somehow to extract something out of the imagination that helps us to anticipate.
But I mean, I'm very much on your side concerning that we shouldn't forget the persons. And I think Loet and I had a lot of discussions about where the communications are and where the persons are in the communication and what's the trigger of what. But if I understood the concept right, then there is anticipation not only on the individual level in our mind, there is also an anticipation which can be probably attributed to a system also that kind of sounds strange, yeah. But there is something collectively we share. We are member of a group, a system, a society, or subparts of that, and this thing also forms an anticipation, and it doesn't talk to you. It's not the oracle which kind of you can go to a temple and then it talks to you, but it expresses itself by various means, and that cannot be bound back to one individual or a group of individuals. Isn't this not correct? So you have anticipation also on another level than the individual mind.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I wanted to follow up on Andrea's comment, because this is my I completely agree with Andrea's comment, because if we think about anticipation and ability to see something new, let's say, if we wanted to be able to see something new in science, we'd have to have deep knowledge of what has come before. And so the system has to provide that knowledge to us in order for us to see the new and then be surprised by it, right? So Isaac Asimov says, the word in science isn't eureka, it's, oh, that's funny, right? That's a funny finding. Why is that the case? And that if we think about any ability to anticipate, it has to be deeply rooted in history. Otherwise, we wouldn't know it's funny, right? How would we know that something is new or different if we didn't already know a lot about the system underlying it? But then I'm getting back to my liminal space here. Obviously, I'm kind of stuck on that today. But, in order to get there, right, there has to be a range of possible findings, right? And so we have this kind of idea of the adjacent possible, right? What is adjacent to what we know that is possible? And my understanding of Loet's recursive knowledge is that we are continually kind of trying out our ideas against a whole range of possible things, and then we make a choice. Now, the choice, it seems to me, is the point of both history plus freedom, or history plus creativity. That is the place where we are most independent, let's say, or individual in our choice, and that then I think I'm saying what I said before, because the question is then, how do we expand that space? If the idea is to increase the adjacent possible, then we have to first educate people to a great extent, but then we also need to leave the space for them to provide information into the system, and then to find the surprise or to find the item that is new or different. And it seems to me that's how we create knowledge, or how we create new information. across that adjacent possible space.
I find this fascinating, and I think hopefully over the next few weeks we'll have a chance to explore some of this. I think the creativity issue is really important. We are going to stop in 5 minutes, so I know Jerome's had his hand up for ages.
No, not this time. I find this discussion very fascinating, and many of the speakers here have very interesting and creative points of view. And I also am looking forward to these discussions in the coming months, and hope I will be able to dedicate the amount of concentration that's necessary. But as to what Caroline was just saying, I would slightly, I was agreeing with you until you mentioned the freedom, which I'm not so fond of in this context. I would say that the logics that we learn and that we in part influence through our careers and lives, that that those are the determining factors. But anyway, you don't have to agree. We don't all have to agree on every point. I was thinking in response to Gerard's point, and also this discussion, these contributions by Carolyn, of the notion of counterfactuals that Judea Pearl has made such a central part of his research program. And in a recent talk that he gave, he mentions the very popular book by Harari. I'm sure many of you have on your coffee table or somewhere. And says basically, Harari says that the key point to human intelligence is this ability to look into the future, to sort of develop counterfactuals. And Pearl tries to develop, more of a analytical framework in which this notion of counterfactuals exists. And he basically has 3 stages. The first stage is action. All maybe sentient beings, or maybe even some artificial intelligence, have some form of action. I carry out an action. I eat. I fly away from danger, and so on. And the second stage for Pearl is this abstraction into the future, which many animals have the ability to with limited extent to do. And the third stage for Pearl is this notion of the counterfactual. If I intervene in this particular context and carry out this particular action or surgery, the potential outcomes of that are such and such versus the outcome if I were not to carry out this particular what he calls surgery. I think these are very particularly useful notions in terms of this concept of anticipation, and I think they are very much wedded to what we human beings are.
Okay, thank you, Jerome. Richard, have you got a comment?
Yeah, really quick on the anticipatory systems and what you said, and the part that's missing to me when I hear the quote about that's really a cool idea. What's missing in what I think is an anticipation is the emotion. It's the dread, it's the joy, it's what we feel, and how we essentially, how important that is into the entire process. It's not straight rational. So when you look at a prediction, to me, a prediction has no emotional content. When I hear the word anticipation, I can feel it in my body. I can feel it in my heart. And part of what I'm always most interested in following this is that, and that's why I'm interested in the rest of this chapter. Loet includes the feeling in the heart, and implicitly I've noticed in all those conversations. And so I'm curious about how that plays itself out more in the next couple of chapters. But I don't want us to forget the fact that there's a heart involved here.
Yeah, I'm going to self-plug for a paper that Loet and I wrote about music, which is trying to address precisely this question.
Yeah.
Look, folks, we need to stop. And we have got plenty of time to explore this further. But thank you so much for your. It's been a wonderful discussion, and it raises so many issues. And I'm just, Jamie, do you want to say anything? But I wonder, Loet, if you just want to say something just as we sign off today, because we will continue this on the Google group, and Loet will engage on that group. But so, Jamie?
I was just going to mention, I put the link to the Google group in the chat room for those who haven't signed up yet. and we will just put all the questions that have been raised in the group to so people can connect and think further. And now, Loet, let's give you the last word or the first word of the day.
You're muted, Loet. Unmute.
Unmute. Yeah. Yeah, Loet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was not. I'm just fine with it. It's too much to react at this moment.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Loet, for writing such an amazingly powerful book. And it's very interesting how our discussion is so concentrated, and this is the power of having well, effectively a code of communication which is in the book, and so our communications are being coordinated by that. That's a very powerful thing, it seems to me. So
thank you all.
Thank you ever so much, and we'll see you again next time. I'll post the videos up, and you can watch it all again.
Okay.
Everyone's wearing red today. It's almost like we had coordinated the uniforms.
Well, there you
Except
go.
Jamie. Jamie's the contrary.
Yeah. All right. Thank you ever so much. I'll see you again soon.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.